Welcome back, everybody. The first thing that we're going to do now that we've introduced integers and the number line is we have to start again with our four operations: multiply, divide, add, and subtract. And now we're going to introduce integers, negatives, and positives, how their signs work when we are multiplying, dividing, adding, and subtracting. I think it is best and easiest to start with multiplying, so that's what we're going to do. There are not many times that I'm going to tell you that you really need to memorize something. Most of the time, that is not the approach that I like to take. But this case, I'm going to tell you, so please believe me, that you have to memorize this. I've given you three rules up here, and they are the rules of how you multiply when you have a negative involved. And the rules are this. Well, if you don't have a negative involved, you know you've been doing that all of your life. So no problem. Positive times a positive is a positive. We can just check that one off. We already know it. Yay. We get to the next one and we've not had negatives before. So if we multiply negative by negative, we're going to get a positive always. And then the next one, if we've got a positive and then we multiply it by negative, we're going to get a negative. So we're just going to work a lot of examples with those, and then they will become just like second nature to you. All right, let's look back at arithmetic. Here we go again. 2 times 5. You've done that forever. You know that's 10. You never really thought about them being positive numbers. There was no reason to, because that's all you'd ever had. So I could write that same one as positive 2 times positive 5, and you know that you would get positive 10. You also know that it's not really necessary for you to put the positive sign, but sometimes you'll see it, so I don't want it to confuse you. In arithmetic again, 3 times 4 is going to be 12, same old, same old. If I have parentheses, it's still the same way of getting, it's just indicating it wants you to find the product. Now, if I'm in algebra, I could certainly start having these negatives pop up, and I will. So I've got negative 2 times negative 5. Well, I know it's 10. I know 2 times 5 is 10. Now my sign, negative times a negative, I just look over here, it's a positive, and I'm going to really look over there until I have that completely memorized. After you go through it with memorization for a while, it will be just part of your nature, and you will learn it and you will know it at that time. Let's take one, negative 3. We just did 3 times 4, both positives. Now let's take a negative 3 and a positive 4. Well, a negative times a positive, and it doesn't matter which way it goes. So a negative times a positive is a negative. 3 times 4 is 12. So we get negative 12. Maybe we have three quantities. Maybe we have a negative 3 times a negative 6 times a negative 1. And we look over there and we're like, there's nothing over here for 3 signs. But that's okay, we'll just use 2 signs, because you know what? Your brain really only takes in 2 operations at a time anyway, only 2 numbers at a time. And so let's just do that consciously. Let's say, all right, well, let's just take negative 3 times negative 6. Well, that's negative times a negative is a positive. So I know that negative 3 times negative 6 is positive 18. And I've got to multiply that by negative 1. So I've got a positive times a negative. Positive times a negative is a negative. 18 times 1 is 18. So I've got negative 18. Let's do another one. Let's say I've got 2 times negative 2 times positive 3. I could just say 3 and we would all know what I meant. But again, I've got 3 signs, so I take 2 at a time. I can take any 2 at a time, but I'll just take the first 2. So these 2 right here give me a positive times a negative, gives me a negative 4. That's what those 2 give me. Now I've got to multiply that by a 3. And so I go negative times a positive is a negative. 4 times 3 is 12, and I get negative 12. I want to take this one next. I want to say negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. Well, in one of our previous segments when we were looking at exponents, we said 1 to any power is still 1. 1 times 1 times 1 as many times is still 1. So that reminds you a little bit, we didn't do it with negatives. So let's take a look at that. We do know that that 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. Now let's figure the sign out. We got 3, so we take 2 at a time. So we're like, okay, negative times negative, positive. I bet you already know that by heart. So we got positive 1 times negative 1. Positive times negative is negative. So my answer, my final answer is negative 1. I had 3 negatives right there. 3 negatives. And what I got was a negative. Okay? We already know that if we have 2 negatives, we're going to get a positive. Now that means that any time we're multiplying 2 negatives together, we're going to get a positive. Remember that. Negative times a negative is a positive. Negative times a negative is a positive. You finish it this time. Negative times a negative is a positive, right? Okay, now let's do 4 negative 1s. Let's do negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. I've got 4 of them. So I'm like, okay, again, I can only do 2 at a time. So I'll just do these 2. Those 2 negatives, any 2 negatives multiplied together gives me a positive. So those 2 give me a positive, and that would be 1 times 1 is 1. These 2 give me a positive, and that would be 1 times 1 is 1. Now, these 2, positive times a positive, piece of cake, positive 1. So now I had 4 negatives, and I came out with a positive. 4 negatives, and I came out with a positive. And I'm really focusing on signs here, not necessarily the ones so much as the signs. Okay, now I'm going to do one with 5. And I know it's getting a little boring, but stay with me a little bit longer. Negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, all multiplied together. I could use any number. I'm just choosing to use 1 because it's so easy and we're not distracted with the numbers. I'm just focusing on the sign. So let's look at 5, doing 2 at a time. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And then there's one little negative left by itself, so there it is. Now I've got 3. A positive times a positive, you know you do 2 at a time, is a positive 1. A positive 1 times a negative 1. A positive times a negative is a negative, so I get negative 1. So this time I had 5 negatives over here. Let's just put it in our list. And our 5 negatives ended up giving us a negative. We could do that for about 30 more minutes, and there would become a pattern that would be so obvious to you that it would just jump out at you. And I don't want to do this with you for 30 more minutes because I don't want you to have to go through that. So I want you to think. Just think about it a minute. Every 2 negatives multiplied together gives you a positive, right? Good. So if I have an even number of negatives, what am I always going to get? A positive. Perfect. Because every even number is evenly divisible by 2. So that means I've got several pairs, that's 2, several pairs of negatives, and every pair of negatives is a positive. So if it's an even number of negatives, I'm going to get a positive. So I could add this one to the list. Let's jump way down and say, what if I have 10 negatives? What sign do you think we would get if we multiplied 10 negatives together? 10 negatives. Positive, exactly. Because I've got pairs of 2 coming out. You've got 5 pairs of 2, and every pair is a positive, so it all turns positive. All right, now let's think about a number like maybe 13. Let's think about any odd number, really. Any odd number. If you've got an odd number, say 5, and you divide it by 2, you're always going to have a remainder because it's not going to come out evenly. 2 will not go into an odd number evenly. You always have a remainder of 1. So that means you always, when you take out your pairs of negatives, your pairs, your 2's, you'll always have 1 negative left. Because every 2 negatives turns into a positive. So every time you've got an odd number of negatives, you're going to end up with a negative. So if I had 13 negatives all multiplied together, I'm going to get a negative. So odd, negative, even, positive, odd, negative, even, positive, odd, negative. We're only talking about the number of signs that we have. So let's do a couple of examples like that. Let's just say that we have negative 2 times positive 5 times negative 1 times positive 3. Now, we're not going to do anything right now, but just a sign. So don't worry about the numbers, just a sign. So what would our sign be? We just say, well, it's all multiplying. I've got 2 negatives. That is an even number. My answer is going to be positive. Okay, let's take another one. Let's suppose that we've got negative 3 times negative 4 times positive 1 times 6, which you know is a positive if there's no number there. And let's say that we've got that times negative 3 again. Well, let's see what that would be. And again, I'm not wanting the answer, I'm just wanting the sign of the answer. So I've got 1, 2, 3 negatives multiplied together. So I've got an odd number of negatives. So my answer will turn out to be negative, my product. Now, this only works for multiplying. It only works when you're trying to find a product. And the reason it works, I want you to understand the reason behind the shortcut. It works because of this right here. This is so important. That anytime you have a negative times a negative, you get a positive. And that leads you to a lot of shortcuts along the way. As we move forward in our study of integers and our study of algebra, we'll be doing so much more multiplying. But that's all for now. I just wanted you to see how the negatives and the positives multiply together. So remember what you're going to do for me. You're going to memorize those 3 rules. And I bet you a nickel that you already know 2 of them by heart. I bet you already know what positive times a positive, I know, is a positive. And I know that as much as we've gone through this morning, that you know that a negative times a negative is also a positive. That every time you have 2 negatives, you have a positive. And so really the one you need to work on the most, a positive times a negative, or a negative times a positive, is a negative. 1 negative has to be a negative. So work on that. Have someone ask you those rules. Write them down a few times. Color them, decorate them, cut them out, put them on the refrigerator. Make a song about them. Whatever works for you. But you can't proceed successfully beyond this point until and unless you master those rules. So that's your assignment for today. Have a great day. See you soon.